an article in The Cut and decided that I needed to tell Chelsea about this. So I mentioned it on the show, and Corinne's lovely team reached out to me. But one thing that I love about this book is that Corinne points out a lot of data and a lot of inequities that we're facing in society, but she doesn't stop there. Every page of this book and every chapter of this book has actionable, real advice for things that you can do in your life to help upset some of those inequities and actually make some changes in your own life and in your own homes to rebalance the scales a little bit. So one thing that you pointed out, Corinne, was that we're at sort of a uniquely difficult time for women to try and have it all. And even more so than in the 70s and 80s. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is?
I think, to be clear, in the 70s and 80s, there were its own challenges, right? But I think right now, in terms of our time, our careers are more demanding than ever. So 40% of American workers now work greater than 50 hours a week. And then our gender roles have changed in the workplace. So we can now kind of envision and compare ourselves to our male colleagues because we're like, we can do everything that you can do, right? But men's gender roles haven't changed at home. So we don't have the same support at home that they do. So men actually do the same amount of housework today as they did in the 1970s.
No way.
The same minutes per day. And then, we had this like kind of tenuous balance between those things, right? And then starting in the 1990s, childcare time, parenting time exploded. So moms today spend twice as much time with our kids as moms did in the 1980s. So, every parent who's here, we know the extended bedtime routine. We're reading a million books. We're processing highs and lows. Okay. In the 1980s, my bedtime routine was go to bed. So that's what's leaving us, feeling like we don't have enough time because it literally doesn't add up in a 24-hour day.
Right. And according to the data, Corinne, is being married to a man a good deal for a woman?
So for anybody who did not read my story in The Cut, I used to be married to a man and now I'm married to a woman, which is not, the main solution I'm prescribing in the book, but it's certainly like an efficient way to navigate some of these challenges all at the same time. But so the issue, right, with marriage as it used to be set up is that it kind of used to be that we had this thing called economic specialization, which was that women specialized in home production and men specialized in market production. And so men were like, I'm doing so great because I have a paycheck, right? And they had something to bring to the table, right? But because, as I said, gender roles have converged at work because women can kind of do the same jobs as men, right? A lot of women don't need a man's paycheck, right? And then what we see in the data is that as her earning power increases relative to his in the household, he doesn't take on more tasks at home. So men who earn 80% of the household income, they do the same amount of housework as the men who earn 20% of the household income. And so women who are female breadwinners do twice as much cooking and cleaning as their lower earning male spouses. And the reason I focus on cooking and cleaning is because I feel like people always think like, well, it'd be understandable if it was childcare, because there are some reasons why, like I'm a mom who's pumping right now, like there's reasons why, like as women, we end up taking on more childcare, but I don't sweep the floor with my uterus. So like the cleaning is not like a biological division that like needs to be set in stone. And so I think I am a big believer in like marriage and partnership, and that like having a household can create a lot of value in our lives, right? But I think that it's a challenging point right now where kind of this old deal has changed, but men haven't updated. They haven't evolved with it. So they're still kind of bringing the same thing to the table, but actually the world around them has shifted. And I think when you look at kind of declining marriage rates, declining fertility, I do think that that's one of the drivers, is that there's some women who are saying like, wait, I can provide for myself economically. So if he's expecting that I'm going to be someone who's going to, cook for him and clean up after him, that's not a good deal for me, right? And so in the book, I try to provide a lot of strategies for like, first of all, how to find a partner who you're going to have a better deal with, a better balance of labor with. And we can get into that if we want to. And second of all, like, okay, if you're already in a partnership and you do feel like this balance of labor is kind of skewed, like how do you actually try to renegotiate that deal?
Right. And one thing that you talk about in the book that I really, really loved is you talk about choosing a life partner like you choose a business partner. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think that we like interview for the wrong position. We interview for the position of boyfriend. Okay. What kind of movies do you like? What kind of music do you listen to? Right. Do we have fun together? Do we have chemistry? Right. And then we find out that like we've actually hired someone to be like the co-CEO of our household. And like they are not prepared for that role. Right. So I think that when you look at the economics of the situation, and this is where like, I get called a monster on Instagram because I'm like, you should look at the economics of marriage, right? And I believe in love. Okay. I think that you should look at love too. But when you look at the economics of the situation, right, your partner is going to be one of the biggest determinants of your financial success. So it's a huge, huge financial decision that you're making when you choose a partner. Because when I look at women's careers, depending on who they marry, depending on how much that person invests in them, that impacts how much time they can spend in the labor force, how much they can earn. So when I see men who aren't picking up their share at home, that directly translates to women's career advancement. Because what you see in those homes is, in the data, she might be earning 4 times as much as him. He still works more hours than her because she's doing so much at home that she can't put those same hours into the labor force. So even when she has the more promising career, she doesn't get those same hours on average, right? So how do you find a partnership that actually allows you to invest in your career? And so how do you ask some of those questions for the people who are, unmarried and are kind of thinking about this, to like ask about what is your preparation and your competence for the role that you're actually going to be serving in, right? Who does your laundry? Know any good recipes? What was the last piece of furniture that you ordered, right? A friend told me a great one. She said, on a date, you should be like, oh, hey, I'm looking for a new dentist in the area. Who's your dentist? And you're going to find out that they don't have a dentist because their mom made their last dentist appointment. And then they're expecting when they get married, you're going to make their next one. Okay. And that is all mental load and work that's going to be put on you, right? So how do you screen for somebody who actually wants to show up as an equal partner?
Yeah. And see, I think I have it pretty good. My husband at home, like he picks up a lot of the slack, but like even tonight I was like, hey, can you just like make sure dinner is taken care of? Like even if you're ordering in, like that's fine. Just like figure out dinner for when I get home. And he looked at me with this like blank stare, this college educated man with a cell phone. So, it does prove true. So what are some of the things that we can actually do about it when we see these inequities in our own home, or we realize we're taking on more than we maybe should? What are some of the conversations we need to be having?
So every time I present my data about time use, because my data shows that, like women do so much more, even when they're the primary breadwinner. And every time I present it, every man in the audience is sure that they are the exception to that. They're like, yeah, those other guys, but not me. I do half, right? And statistically, they can't all be the exception to it. So I do think that like men are well intentioned. I think that they want to do half, but I think they're doing half of what they can see. And that's like the tip of the iceberg. And then there's this like iceberg of invisible labor underneath the surface, right? So he's like, I do half of the daycare drop-offs, but it's like in order to even get to daycare drop-off, somebody had to shop for seasonally appropriate clothes and get rid of last season's clothes. They had to meal plan, they had to pack lunches, they had to set up play dates and after school care. They had to make sure the kid had a doctor's appointment to get those shots before the school year started, right? So that's all the invisible labor. And so I actually recommend that couples track their time, because the data that's in this book, it comes from this survey called the American Time Use Survey, where couples track their time. And people are always shocked when they see this data. And so you can kind of have that same like, okay, let's see what the evidence says in your household by tracking your time. And like a lot of times when couples do this, they'll see that like, when the husband goes to work, his time tracking spreadsheet is like work. But when like the mom goes to work, it's, work, call the pediatrician to confirm an appointment, work, order groceries on a Zoom call, work, like answer text from the panicked 7th grader or whatever, deal with a pickup snafu, right? So time is like Swiss cheese. So, and then the best way to do this is that before you start tracking your time, say, what would be a fair division of labor in our household? How should we split these tasks? How do you think it should be divided? And like, no one is going to say, oh, I think you should do 70% and I should do 30%, right? You're going to establish, we are both bought in that we should do 50-50. And then when you track it, you can be like, interesting, right? So, and then you have that basis to try to move closer to what you've both agreed is actually the objective.
All right. Well, your research uncovered a pretty big paradox, and that is that as women gain more freedom and opportunity over the last 50 years, our happiness actually went down. So, can you talk a little bit about that and what conversations you were having in real life mirrored the data that you were seeing?
So I start the book with, my own story of like, I say in 2017, I gave birth to my son and also a midlife crisis because I really believed that like I was very feminist. And I was like, if I just want it enough and I try hard enough, like I'm going to be able to be an equal at work and at home. Right. And I felt like I was failing. I was falling behind in my career. My male colleagues were like publishing more papers than me and they were going up for tenure faster than me. I didn't feel like I was the type of mom that I wanted to be. I was exhausted all the time. I had a 2.5-hour commute and I was like pumping on the Amtrak bathroom crying because I was going to miss bedtime, miss the actual quality time, right? Just trying to, still squeeze out whatever I could from the workday. So, that's when I started studying time use and kind of seeing how our time was getting so squeezed and so crunched, which was such a freeing thing for me to just be like, oh, it's not me. It's not in your head. It's in the data, right? It just doesn't add up. And I think the issue is that because women are two-way players, because we're playing offense and defense, we can, again, have the exact same career as a man can have, but we also take on these roles at home. We compare ourselves in both domains. So in our careers, we expect to be able to have the same career as our male colleagues, but we're coming to the table with half a deck of cards because he has the support at home that we are providing at home, right? And then at home, we still expect ourselves to be able to be that like Instagrammable domestic goddess, like perfect mom who's like available for our kids at all times and like never snaps or, never loses patience. And like those things are two separate full-time jobs that actually like do not fit in one. We still get just like the same 7 days in our week, right? So they do not actually fit. But I think that is part of what's leading us to be less happy is that we feel like, okay, I should be performing at this level here. I should be performing at this level here. In fact, I'm not doing either of those. And so I see the book as a little bit of like a answer to Lean In, because Lean In said like, well, just focus on your career and like push harder there and like use your life as a battering ram against these structural inequalities that you're facing, right? And I think the gap that's most important for us to close is the gender happiness gap. The fact that women are now less happy than men on surveys all around the world because we are doing too much and we feel like we're failing. And so, I think we'll get into this a little bit more, but like, I don't view the objective of your life as maximizing your career success. I view it as maximizing what's most important to you. And I think that that's what we have to figure out is like what we actually can say no to, where we need to invest our time, where we're getting a good return for our time, because the old sort of way of doing things and the old way of measuring our success, it's leaving a lot of women on the brink.
Yeah. You talk about a woman who you were talking to. I don't know if this was at a party or a function, but that she said, oh my gosh, I haven't gone for a run, which is her self-care in 4 years. And meanwhile, you had just talked to her husband who talked about how he goes for an hour-long swim every day. So
every day. She said, I haven't gone for a run since my son was born. And I was like, okay, what's happening here in the allocation of the joint time and money budget in this household that's leaving one person with this much leisure time and self-care time and the other person not? And by the way, that's a checkup I recommend. Like, if you're not sure, because you're like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do things 50-50 because like maybe his job is more demanding or maybe there's some reason things shouldn't be 50-50. Are you getting equal leisure time in your household? Right? Because if both of your contributions to the household are being valued equally, then you're still going to have that equal leisure time, even if some other things are allocated differently.
Yeah. I have to tell you, one of my favorite pieces of advice in the book is to start planning your divorce as early as possible. Ideally, right after you get married. Corinne, I mean, obviously you don't want every woman to leave her heterosexual marriage, but what do you mean by that?
Okay, so when I teach negotiation, and you can read about it in the book, I have the story of teaching negotiation to girls in Zambia and how it's very empowering. And one of the most important things when you teach negotiation is that you always know what your BATNA is, which is your best alternative to negotiated agreement, right? And so if you feel like the situation that you're in is your only option, right, then you don't have a good BATNA and you're very disempowered. And so I think the same thing about your job, that, if you're, before you're going to go ask your boss for something, you have to know, like, what are my other options in this market? And you make that BATNA as good as possible before you go into a negotiation. And I think that because nobody wants to think about, the unexpected, right? Nobody wants to think about what I call the 3 Ds: divorce, death, or disability, that can happen in a marriage, right? We often don't plan for a world that looks very different than the world we're in right now, right? But when we get married, like, everybody's like madly in love with each other and everything is happy. Things change, people change. And like I said, people's health changes. And there's this push right now for women to kind of go back to this idea to kind of romanticize the past. Because as I said, there was this deal in the past of, like, men specialize in the market, women specialize at home. And there's this push right now to romanticize that and say, like, well, let's just go back to that, because women could relax and they could just spend time with their kids and they didn't have to worry about working, right? But that's a very risky position to be in, because if you are investing in public goods, the household and the children, well, he's investing in a private good, his human capital, his career. He gets to walk away with that when you get divorced, right? The biggest asset formed in a marriage is often the husband's career, his future earning power, and he gets to take all of that with him. And so I think for young women, it's very important to think about, what would my life look like if the terms of this agreement changed, if the person I'm with right now changed? Again, it's not to say that that's going to happen, but we can't predict the future, right? And am I investing in things that are going to be supportive to me and to my children, right? Rather than only public goods within the household. There's a lot of women who, ended up, kind of divorced by surprise and found out, like, okay, actually, you're not entitled to Social Security because you haven't been paying into that, right? You haven't had these earnings. And that's a bunch of things with policy that we should be doing different to, like, actually take seriously women's contributions in the household as economic contributions. But with the way our economy and our divorce laws work right now, you are not protected. And so I think that, it's just, and I think the same thing as I said about your career. It's like, well, what does my career look like if AI replaces this industry, right? Again, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so you're really trying to think about just, how am I prepared for those branching paths that life can take?
And so, speaking a little bit more about the branching paths, you talk about sort of this fallacy of sunk costs, or decisions that we've made based on a different time in our life. So things are one way. We make decisions based on where we're going to live, who we're going to be married to, what job we're going to have, what our commute time is going to be like. And then things can change, and we feel like we still need to stay in that vein because that's the decision we make, and we have to stick with it and make everything else around us work within those constraints. But let's talk a little bit about how to recognize when it's time for a change and how to make those changes.
Yeah. So human beings have sort of status quo bias. It's easier for us to stay in a situation that's not working and just keep trying to make it work. And, like, also women are, like, amazing at making things work, right? So we're just like, okay, I can do this. I can bend and twist myself into a pretzel to make this work. And that was a huge mistake that I made in my marriage, was just trying to continue kind of bending and twisting into a pretzel to kind of make something add up that wasn't adding up. And what I say is, like, I forgot that I was a member of the household, because as women, we're, like, so concerned with making everything work for all the members of the household, like meal planning around, like, this preference and this restriction and whatever. And we forget to include ourselves in that equation. If something's not working for you, it's not working for the family. You're actually part of the family. So I liken it to building a tower, and it's supported by, like, a misshapen block at the bottom. And then, because you have the whole tower built on top, you really can't picture any way to, like, change that block, because you're like, everything is resting down on it, right? But if you would actually go through the pain of kind of letting things fall down and, like, rebuilding, potentially you're going to have a much more structurally sound tower. I'll stretch the analogy. So I think that we sometimes fail to make changes, exactly as you said, when things have actually shifted and that foundation is no longer serving us. And because we are facing so many constraints in our lives, often the changes I think we need to make are not ones that lean in, not ones that just push harder against the constraints, but what I call level ups, ones that actually change the optimization, change the equation by removing some of those constraints. And so, examples of that are like making a choice to say, like, actually, I wanted my kids to have like the big house in the suburbs that had like the yard and the pool or whatever. But right now we need to live closer to my job because this commute is killing me. So that's what we're going to do. Or actually, we need to be in a cheaper apartment because actually having to pay so much rent is making me stay in a work situation that I'm very unhappy in, right? Or like I tell stories in the book of like some people were in a dream job kind of passion field and they like are like, quote, I love my job. But then when you have kids, what you love more than your job is actually getting to raise your kids, and realize like, oh, I need to be a little bit more transactional with my job. I'd rather be in a field where I put in a certain number of hours and I get paid and I'm not having to pour my heart and soul into it for such little money, right? So I talk a lot about in the book about trying to find these kind of level ups and also working your way there by kind of thinking about small changes that you can make if you're not ready for sort of those big shifts. But that's sort of I think we've been taught to think that like the solution to a problem is just more effort by us. And I want us to think that like sometimes we actually need more from the situation. It's not going to be enough to just keep pouring ourselves into something that's not working.
Okay, so to that point, I want you to talk a little bit about using your job, as you describe it in the book, as technology to turn time into money. And I want to quote you here. So you say, leisure time must be accounted for in advance and treated as a sacred obligation, just like meeting with your boss, instead of the treat you're allowed after the to-do list is done, allowed to have after the to-do list is done, because the to-do list will always be there, but the time will not. And I almost like went through the page I was highlighting so much. So how can you pay yourself first with time?
So again, we've been conditioned as women to think that like our objective in life is career success. And so it's like, just put as much time there as possible, right? But as an economist, and those of you who took managerial economics at Wharton, you'll remember this, what we think of humans as maximizing is something called utility. And I describe this in the book. It's kind of like happiness, but it's a little bit like deeper and richer because it's like the sum total of your joy, fulfillment, contentment, meaning over your lifetime, okay? It's not just career success. And the things that give us utility are, yes, some things that we can buy with money, but they're also things we do with our time, spending time with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, vacation, leisure time, right? And so the more time that we put into this money machine, your job is an ATM that you put time into and you get money out of, right? The less time we have to directly sort of get utility from these other sources. And so you have to decide in my utility function that only you know, how much of it is served by money, by things you can purchase with money, by material goods, and how much of it is served by things that you can do with your time, right? And that also means it helps you reframe what it means to be productive, because we think of it as productive to work and not as productive to take leisure time. But if I'm measuring productivity and utility points, if I use my time to do something that gives me joy, that's just as productive as using my time to work, to get paid in money, to buy something that gives me joy, right? That's like a longer, more roundabout conversion to get that same happiness as an output. So when you're taking leisure time, what you're going to say to yourself is, I am being so productive right now, making utility, okay? And you've got to block it out on your calendar, because again, it's like, I think this is more so true for women. We end up only taking time for ourselves, like at the end of the day when we're so depleted. And so it's like the time crumbles at the bottom of the muffin bag. And so we just end up like scrolling on our phones or doing something that's not that meaningful to us, because that's the only time we end up getting that time for ourselves. Whereas if we flip it, if we put our leisure time first, and we block it out, then you get that like good, juicy time to actually do something that really recharges and restores you. And like the rest of the stuff will actually get done. And it will also help equalize things in your household, because there's this great story from a woman who read my book early, and she was telling me what she changed. And she was like, she started paying herself first in leisure time because she used to like do all the chores and then run out of time to go to the gym, but she started like flipping it. And when she did that, she realized not only did she get the housework done in a shorter period of time, because that was all the time she had, but by the time she got home, her partner was there to help her, because it turned out he'd been paying himself first with leisure time the whole time.
Yeah. You talk about speaking with a friend who when you were thinking about leaving your marriage, you were worried that it would make things harder. You would have so much more to do and so much less time as you didn't have a partner to be helping you. So let's talk about that and letters from your future. I thought this was such a good point.
So I had a friend tell me, like, you think it's going to be harder, but it's going to be easier. And I was like, that's crazy, because it's going from like, you know, 2 adults to like divide the work to be done to like 1 who has to do everything. Right. And then it turned out it was easier. And then I started studying time use, and I found out that women's time cooking and cleaning goes down after divorce, because he wasn't splitting the work to be done. He was actually creating work that she was doing. So part of that time is actually being put into him, right? And you know, that's for marriages that aren't working, right? So hopefully for marriages that are working, there's like a better division. But for marriages that aren't working, women's time goes down after divorce. And miraculously, men's time cooking and cleaning goes up after divorce, because once there's not a woman to do it, to clean up after him, he finds where the broom is kept, and he figures out how to order dinner on his cell phone.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
But I think, like I described, with that misshapen block and like needing to let things fall down, it can be so hard to picture the other side of a big change. And so one of the things I recommend is like writing yourself a letter from the future to say, like, if once I make these changes, once I do these really hard things, and it's not necessarily going to be breakups, it's going to be, you know, it could be a job change, it could be, you know, trying to make it to a career milestone. What is my life going to look like? What's it going to feel like? How am I going to feel, right? Describing to say, I want to feel like I can relax, like I can be patient with my kids, like my shoulders aren't like up here all the time, like I'm not exhausted and depleted all the time, I'm not on the brink of tears all the time. And if any of that sounded familiar, I hope you take that as a mandate to make changes, because you matter. Like, your experience of your life matters. And I think as women, and especially mothers, we lose sight of ourselves as like the protagonist of our own lives, that, you know, our experience matters. Like, just what is our day-to-day like? We wouldn't tolerate like one of our kids being on the brink of tears every day. We would be like, something needs to change. This is not okay, right? But we tolerate it for ourselves. And so once I did make that big change, and I left my marriage and I moved to Philadelphia, and I traded a 2.5-hour commute for a 7-minute commute, I actually felt grief for my former self that hadn't thought that I deserved how much easier things were for me, right? To say that, oh, wow, like I had to really be pushed to like make this change, and I would never have done it just for me. You know, I had to really get pushed. And I was like, I don't ever want to let myself be my own last priority in life. Right. And so that's what I hope, you know, the book is going to give you, is like a real call to action to say that you deserve a life that is happy and fulfilled, where you have what you need, where other people's needs get met too. It doesn't mean that other people's needs don't get met, right? But it cannot be at the expense of your own. And I think what kind of got me over my mom guilt in doing that was that I actually saw my relationship with my son blossom when I was getting my needs met, because I could be present with him. And I think what your kid needs more than like whatever you're making yourself crazy over, whether it's the homemade baby food or the hand decorated birthday cupcakes or the, you know, perfect home that looks immaculate or whatever, or the 1,000 activities that are in like 6 different directions on like 12 different days in the week, even though there's only 7 days. What your kid needs is for you to be okay, for you to be able to connect with them, sit on the floor with them, listen to a story for the 1,000th time, right? And when you kind of, you know, put on your own oxygen mask first, like, you will see that that's not actually taking anything away from them.
You know, as women, we're sort of constantly thinking about our biological clock, mm-hmm. and whether having kids is something that we want to do. And we run into this thing where, you know, in our careers, our 20s and early 30s are taken up by, you know, mm-hmm. sprinting and like trying to get the brass ring, as you say so often in your book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like the right time to have kids and whether there is one.
Yeah. So I will, spoiler alert, I say in the book, there's not, right? Like, it's going to be disruptive whenever you do it. Right. And it's also, if you haven't had kids, like, to tell you a letter from your future, it's going to be the most wonderful and important thing that you do, and you're never ever going to regret it. And so, I think trying to say that the goal is to time that optimally for our career is just taking this super capitalistic approach to our lives that, our purpose in life is career maximization, instead of, our purpose is to live a good life. And if parenthood is something that's important to you, then nothing could be more important. And you should do that at the time that works for you and your family, right? That said, because I study these issues, I do also recommend that if you get to 34 and you're not ready to have kids right now and you think you want to, freeze your eggs, okay? They're never going to be younger than they are right now, okay? So that's the practical advice, because that's it. That period in your life goes really fast, as I think a lot of women here can attest, that you're like, oh wait, wasn't I just 30? What happened? So yeah, I think I talk a lot in the book about thinking about the arc of your life, thinking about the chapters of your life, right? And that's one of the things I think we need more from our policymakers, is allowing us to have flexibility in our careers across the life cycle, that we should have more on-ramps for women whose kids are in high school and now they have a lot of human capital and they're really ready to be on the fast track, right? But you want to think about that arc of your life. You want to zoom out a little bit. And so with our careers, to think, all right, when do I have time to invest? And I think it's smart to invest in your 20s when you have a lot of, time, and okay, I can try to climb the ladder then, but am I on a career path that is going to grow with me, where, oh, I'm going to be able to not keep investing into my 30s and 40s? Or is it the prize for the pie eating contest is more pie? Congrats, you made partner, and now you still work all the time, right? So how is that career going to grow with you? How is that relationship going to grow with you? And so, to me, it's not about denying yourself and saying, oh, I have to put this off into it until a certain point. It's just about thinking about those stages of your life and kind of, zooming out a little bit and taking that perspective of how are these choices going to serve me over these very different periods. And there's a chart in the book of these 3 eras of your life, and kind of thinking, and one of them, the one in the middle, is called the squeeze, where time and money pressures often are pushing down at the same time. And so it's really about saying, how am I going to get through that squeeze?
All right, before we transition into Q&A, what are a few ways that parents can reclaim their time?
Okay, so we already talked about rebalancing things with your partner. I think that's really important. Saying no to things, deciding what things are and are not a good investment of your time. So I call it throwing out your house plants, because I would love to be the person who has the aesthetic herb garden on my window, and every time they die every time. Okay, I'm just not that person right now. I have a baby and a book baby, and I'm not going to be that person right now, and that's okay. I think, again, it's giving yourself permission, once you see the time use data, to be some of these ideas I have in my head of what success looks like do not actually add up with the minutes that I have to make this work. So saying no to things, it might be setting that limit to say, look, we have to get all the kids' activities on 2 weeknights a week, right? We have to stack them up, or we have to, make a compromise that maybe this isn't your preferred soccer team or this isn't your preferred dance class, but we have to get them on the same nights so that I'm not driving in 40 different directions every night of the week, right? So because some of that explosion in time, parenting time, is about us understanding child development and what it takes to make a human now in a way that we didn't in the 80s. And some of it is what economists call the rugrat race, that we're in this competition to pour as much into our kids as possible so they can grab one of those limited spots at, Harvard or whatever. And I think we have to, as a society, be all right, we've got to say no to some of those things. And one last thing, and then there's, more strategies in the book, but I will also mention outsourcing, because I think this is something we feel a lot of guilt about. We feel it's if we outsource, we're snooty, and we're it's an unaffordable luxury. But I'm going to name some tasks that we outsource that nobody says this about. So getting your oil changed by a professional mechanic, getting your plumbing fixed by a plumber, getting your gutters cleaned by someone who cleans gutters, or your roof fixed, right? So when it's male-coded tasks, we actually don't think twice about outsourcing them. Very modest income families go to a mechanic to get their oil changed, even though anybody could actually watch a YouTube video and change your oil. But we just think that men's time has value. That's why. That's the reason. That's the reason that feels so differently, those things I named, than if I name, a personal chef or a meal service, a cleaning service, a professional organizer. And those things sound like unaffordable luxuries, but it's literally just putting a value on your time. Because why is it, $70 instead of an hour of a man's time, right? But you can't pay an organizer $70 instead of an hour of your time. So I think flipping the narrative on outsourcing to say not outsourcing something is hiring yourself to do it. And you actually have a full-time job, and maybe you can't afford to hire yourself for so many tasks.
All right. We can open it up to questions if anyone has any questions.
Yes.
Hi. Thanks so much for being here. This is a fascinating discussion. One thing you mentioned was that men's role, or the time that they spend at home doing the cooking and cleaning, has not changed since the 1950s. So as a mom of a 9-year-old boy, what that tells me is societally we are failing in how we raise our children,
Yes.
especially our boys.
Yes.
So what suggestions do you have for breaking that cycle with the next generation so that the next generation of people don't have the same issues again and again and again?
Yes. It's so important. And I'm raising an 8-year-old boy and think about this all the time. And so one thing is really engaging our boys in the work of living, the shared work of the household, that this is how we support and take care of each other. And I don't even personally, I don't pay for chores. It's this is what it takes to run a household, right? We do this together because girls, the data shows that girls get engaged in those things and boys get engaged in paid chores. So boys get paid to mow the lawn, or they get paid to take out the trash, and girls just, it's set the table, it's, help do the dishes, it's fold the laundry. So saying to our boys hey, I'm folding laundry, let's fold this laundry together, let's set the table together. This is just what we do to make the household function. I would love us to actually teach, home ec in schools, especially to boys. But I'll say one more thing, which is that's actually why it's so important to have boundaries for yourself and to care for yourself. Because if you let yourself be endlessly depleted in service of your children, you are modeling for them that they can expect that from their wives, right? So you actually have to model that you are a person that has needs and desires and interests, and that, your happiness matters, because that's what's going to allow that relationship for them in the future. Questions? Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit, but maybe go a little deeper. What do you think about that concept of economic specialization? Someone in the home and someone in the professional marketplace now looking for it?
Well, I think in a lot of households, this still happens to some degree. It's not 100% one way or the other, but in a lot of households, I meet families all the time where, we both have law degrees, but we decided it made more sense for him to work the 8 hours a week and make partner, and I moved into a recruiting role, or I moved it right. So that specialization, it still happens in a lot of families. I think that it's very risky, as I said, from the perspective of how does life evolve? And I do think it's super important for women to always be maintaining their human capital to be able to potentially step back into the labor force if they need to. And there's, a lot of kind of ways to think about doing that, right? And I just think always asking that question, okay, if I needed to hit go again, what am I doing to maintain my professional network? What am I doing to keep my skills current? Because to me, the issue with specialization is that it doesn't happen in reverse, by and large. It's the exception, right? In the data, what I see is that when the woman is the one earning more, like I said, she's not getting the support at home. And so, and even when he doesn't have a job at all, at that point, when a man is unemployed, he does do a little bit more housework, but the amount that he does compared to a woman who's unemployed, right, is completely dwarfed. And he actually has a lot more leisure time. That's what we see in the data. So I think that's the problem, is that we know it's that model is still so deeply gendered. So it's that could be fine if okay, sometimes we lean into your career, sometimes we lean into my career, if it was happening both ways. And so that's one of the questions that I recommend you ask a potential future partner, is asking, if I got a job offer in another city that would pay me 50% more, but you would have to look for new work, would we move? Right? Because anybody can say, of course, your career is more important to mine, as just as important as mine, but to actually think about it as, oh, I would have to pay a cost. That's what it means to invest in your career. It actually comes at a cost to me. And women do that all the time, but I don't see that in reverse.
Do we have another question over here?
Yeah. I graduated from college 40 years ago, and Beverly Sills said at the time to our class, you can have it all, but not at the same time, right? So are you saying, yes, you can have it all, just we need to bring the men up with us? And what would you say to that?
Well, some of you have my tote bags that I designed that say having it almost, because I think, what we realistically can have is we can have what we need to have a happy life, right? But we cannot have this vision of perfection like in our careers and at home, where, like I said, we are actually operating as two separate full-time jobs, the trad wife at home and the, super career woman in the office. Those things, that's actually not compatible. So I think what you have to choose what your all is and decide that your all is what makes your life happy, what makes it add up, what makes you be able to get the time you want with your kids, get the leisure time that you want, and have a career that you find fulfilling. But that it's not going to be this perfect vision of, with fairy dust sprinkled all over it, right? And so that's why I say it's you're having it almost. Yes.
Hi, you were talked about negotiation and teaching negotiation. Is that in the book also, or what? How does that relate to what you were talking about?
Yeah, so I talk about in the book a couple of stories about negotiations. So I'll just share a little bit. So one is that I have this big, long-standing research project teaching girls negotiation skills in Zambia. And this is an environment where girls were very disempowered. There's very strong gender hierarchies and age hierarchies. And so the question is, how do you empower someone in that environment? And it would be really disingenuous for us to go in and say, you go, girl, you can do anything that you want, because the reality is they were facing these constraints. And so the goal of teaching negotiation was to teach them to actually find power through their relationships by teaching them that, if they could actually be a problem solver and make things work better in their household, they actually had power they didn't know they had. And so what we find is that the girls we taught these negotiation skills, and anyone who studied this, it's called integrative bargaining. You're making the pie bigger for everyone. So it doesn't feel like you're taking something away from someone because you're making the pie bigger. They were able to support their parents better in the household and therefore go to school for longer. And we actually just went back 10 years after we did this, and we're still seeing impacts 10 years later of them going to college at higher rates, being more likely to have delayed marriage, less likely to have HIV, delayed fertility, all from literally a 2-week class where we taught them these negotiation skills. And so that's part of the, I tell the story in the book to say that, when you're trying to ask for something, right, that this style that is more associated with women of saying how can I make this work for everyone, that can actually be very powerful. And that sometimes we place too much weight on this idea that, we need to act like men and we need to be more assertive and aggressive, right? That there actually is power in these styles that we consider more female typical.
So I wanted to ask about, you talked a lot about time labor and career labor. There's this concept of emotional labor, in a family. And I found it takes so much effort to keep myself emotionally grounded and supportive of others in my family. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and a lot of the times I wonder, in trying to bring my husband in on this too, am I trying to change him? Wondering if there's any research on the equity surrounding emotional labor.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that women take on more of that, right? And it's not even just at home, it's at work too, right? It's how often does someone come crying into your office? And they would never do that into a male colleague's office, right? Yeah, so we are constantly, caring for others around us. And I think we sometimes pour too much caring into kind of everybody around us, because I think that's actually something we're evolutionarily conditioned to do. And we have to actually recognize that is something that is, we are called to do by this force that is bigger than us, that the force of that's, millions of years old in our genes, and that it might not actually be serving our interests. That's not to say with our kids, right? But it's still just saying there is this tendency that we have to care, too much about everything and pour love and care into everybody. So one is, actually recognizing that for yourself, that it's okay for you to even have limits on your emotional labor, right? To say hey, I got to take care of myself right now. What do I need to be emotionally regulated? Actually, I need an hour where nobody talks to me, right? And so right now it's go find your dad if you need to talk about something, right? And I don't think, like all things, like everybody kind of has to be able to take on roles in the household. That doesn't mean people aren't going to have different styles and different strengths, right? I don't think it's trying to change your husband to kind of clue him in to be like, hey, look, like you might not realize that like I spend 2 hours a night talking to our teenager who's like going through this tough thing, and that's a lot for me to process, you know? And what are some ways that either you can get more involved in this or you can support with something else that's going to take something off my plate, right? And I think I talk about like this method, Eve Rodsky, who's a Santa Monica resident who has this book, Fair Play. And she talks about like when you're going to divide things up, you want to go like end to end where somebody takes like that entire stream so that you don't even have to think about it, right? Because I think for moms, we're often still holding on to the like, okay, have to make sure that this happens. And like, okay, I'm going to go give dad a pep talk before he goes talks to the teenager about this issue so that I make sure he doesn't end up yelling at the teenager, right? Well, you've still taken on like all the work that's associated with that, right? So, you know, how can you figure out things that he is able to take on where he's able to own like that complete work stream end to end, right? And I think that, you know, it's great because you can say to him like, no, I don't need a low-level junior employee to delegate to. I need a co-CEO. So like you're getting a promotion. This is great for you, right? You're going to have real ownership of this set of stuff so that I cannot think about it at all. And I don't want you to talk to me about it. And I don't want to have like follow-up questions about it.
I often hear the excuse building on this, like I call it the mental load, more than just like the emotional, because like he can do like bring her to the birthday party, but I'm still gonna think about the present that needs to be purchased before the party and all the things. So like you have to count the mental load.
Yeah.
And I often hear like, well, like women are just better at that, and I don't buy it because like he project manages things at work.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And all the little things, he makes sure all the details and dots are checked or whatever.
Yeah.
So like, how do you deal with negotiating with someone who's like, it's just not my strength, and it's gonna be like you're gonna do it way faster.
Yeah.
And you also believe it and say you're probably right, so I just do it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Well, we'll take a B+ on this one.
Yes, that's right. That's right. We don't need an A+ on everything. Yes, that's exactly right. And so what I say is like, if somebody really owns something end to end, then they're going to own all of the sort of like successes and failures, and there's going to be learning on the job. So, you know, if you delegate pack the lunch, then you're still owning like, okay, I have to make sure we have the right snacks there, and I have to make sure it gets unpacked and it gets washed. Okay, if he owns like plan the lunch, pack the lunch, and clean out the lunch boxes, then he's going to learn that like if he sends wheat thins instead of Triscuits, they come back uneaten every time, right? And he's going to learn that like if he doesn't wash it out on Friday, it's really gross when he goes to pack it again on Monday, right? And so you've got to let him like own that versus like stepping in every time and being like, oh, okay, let me fix this. And then with that, this is another Eve Rodsky concept, is you agree on minimum standard of care, right? You agree to say like, okay, you're in charge of lunch, but let's both align on the fact that like we want our kids to have this kind of nutritional mix, right? It's always a vegetable, a protein, a whole grain, or whatever. So that's the minimum standard of care. But then, however that happens, you do have to let go of. It's like the sandwiches are not going to be in star shapes, and like that is okay, right?
Well, Corinne is going to be here signing books as
one
well.
more question.
And-
We can do one. She said we can do one more.
Oh, great. Okay.
It's not
Perfect.
even a question. It's I was reared by my single dad for a while, and they got a divorce when we were really little. And there's one time we showed up at daycare. Well, I did. My sister's always perfect. I showed up without underwear on. So when I had to put my pajamas on for the nap, the teacher had to, pull me aside and make a note. And I'm sure she talked to my dad afterwards. Never happened again.
Because they learn, right? Yeah, that's right. And I think sometimes we're like, we don't want to deal with that short-term pain, right, of the learning by doing. But it's like that is the way that you figured this out. Like he is a competent human being. He will figure this out also. And and the biggest way that I call like BS on that is that because in the time use data, I see that women do so much more of the cooking, and yet like men are like all of the Michelin starred chefs, right? This is not about ability, right? It's just about, do you concern yourself with the mundane things that don't seem like that important that actually keep a household functioning? And if we treat both of our time as equally valuable, then like I need you to care about Triscuits versus wheat thins.
Awesome. Well, Corinne is going to be signing books up here for anyone who wants to get their book signed. And thank you all for being here. This has been so fantastic.
And thank you to the men, especially also for, you know,
Yes.
letting, you know, getting
For the
taken
male
down a
allies.
little bit of a